After appearing on maps all around the world for centuries, some names disappeared as if they had never been there. There was no documented conflict, no treaty to signify their demise, and no explicit justification at all. The map's letters gradually disappeared to be replaced by new ones, century after century, until the memory of them vanished entirely. Tartaria. The name was originally used on elaborately detailed antique maps, in explorers' accounts, and in merchants' notebooks. However, it only exists today as a folktale written off as myth or as a faint ink smear in archives. Who made the decision to remove it? More significantly, what about it was so dangerous that it had to vanish? The remnant traces are dispersed. Old maps that are obviously marked with the name History Now Act as Thothi never knew. Odd buildings are hidden away in contemporary cities, and identical architectural styles are found across distant continents. When you put all those pieces together, the final result is very different from what you were taught in school. The world has been keeping a secret for more than a century, and tonight, on this special edition of Bedtime History, we're going to trace those fading lines on the map through centuries of silence and layers of dust. The term Tartaria existed in a much more elusive form prior to being prominently engraved onto maps in the 16th century, not as a well-defined region with tidy bounds, but more as sporadic remarks. Occasionally, a few lines in old chronicles that extend from east to west. At this time, geography was still based on a combination of first-hand knowledge, stories from the Eastern Tang and Song dynasties, traveling merchants, and the imagination of real voyages. Chinese documents described far-off regions in the north and northwest that were inhabited by nomadic tribes that hunted, lived on horseback, and migrated with the seasons. Depending on the time period, they referred to them as that, Dayat Jotquat, then Mongols, and other names. These regions were depicted as having a terrible environment in books like the New Book of Tangs and the History of Song, with winters so long that snow and ice covered the ground for most of the year. However, it is also abundant in minerals, furs, and horses that are known for their endurance. These descriptions closely resemble the area that would eventually be called Tartaria on European maps, even though they never used the term. The Islamic world also left its accounts farther west, descriptions of Tatar or Turk tribes in the far north, dwelling on unending stairs connected by trade routes that followed huge rivers and lakes, may be found in the writings of Al-Adrichi from the 12th century, as well as in Persian and Arab chronicles. They were depicted as ferocious fighters who were equally adept at trade and conquest, with the capacity to lead armies over great distances, quickly, a quality that both frightened and impressed people. Stories of merchants or envoys who had been to places outside of the known world were frequently documented in medieval Latin texts written by monks and academics in Europe. They saw this as a mysterious area that was occasionally connected to religious myths like Gog and Magog, according to legend. Two biblical nations are imprisoned behind enormous walls, waiting for the day when they will be able to escape and take over the world. According to medieval Mappa Mundi maps, the area is a vast area in the far north that is filled with images of mysterious walled cities that are unlike anything in Christendom, and riders brandishing bows. The remarkable thing is that these Recordings share some important characteristics, even though they were created in very different eras and societies. The area's astounding expanse, the people's strong relationship with horses, their prowess in combat, and the presence of Ophergonist settlements. Such details imply that, in the midst of the limitless grasslands, there might have been trading hubs, or centers of authority, large enough to make an effect on outsiders. This is far from the idea of completely dispersed nomadic tribes. Tartaria was not yet a recognized geographic name at this point. Depending on their viewpoint and level of interaction, each culture has a unique term for it. However, when we put the pieces together, we can make out the general shape of a common area, a huge landmass that spans a large portion of northern Eurasia and acts as a bridge and a natural barrier between east and west. Then the 13th century arrived, and history changed. The gates to this huge territory were thrown wide by a military upheaval, which turned it from a remote mystery into a direct participant in the global power dynamics. At this moment, the name Tatars started to gain traction beyond sporadic references. Eurasia's political and military turmoil thrust this formerly nebulous region into the very center of history. Now, Tatars and Tartas are more than just a geographical designation. They turned into a picture that became ingrained in the public consciousness, half based in folklore, half in history. Their rise was associated with the Mongol Empire's conquests in the eyes of Europe. Most Westerners were unable to differentiate between the several tribes when Genghis Khan and his descendants, cavalry, surged across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Hence, they all went by the same name, Tartars. Most likely, the second R was added from Europe. Perhaps it was only a mispronunciation or an attempt to distinguish the name, but it had an unexpected consequence. It gave the term a sound reminiscent of Tartarus, the Greek mythological abyss of punishment. The name had an even darker edge just from that association. Factual and fanciful depictions abound in the chronicles of the time, from Matthew Paris of England to Giovanni Depand, del Carpin, the Franciscan messenger. Horse-drawn armies, shooting, with lethal accuracy from the saddle, moving like the wind. Entire territories were stripped of their inhabitants. Cities were besieged and overwhelmed in a matter of days, and people were held together by iron discipline. Notes on their rigorous military organization, messenger relay stations, and road networks connecting key power centers are interspersed with these terrifying pictures. Information that contradicted the completely savage perception that many Europeans wished to maintain. Folklore started creating its own portrayal of the Tatars alongside history. They were soldiers from the edge of the world who crossed frozen gates or perished in deserts in European legends. According to certain tales, they possessed extraordinary abilities. Exaggerated claims were made about swords that never rusted, fortresses that were hard to capture, and the capacity to travel impossibly long distances without stopping. These stories demonstrate the profound impact they had. Islamic chroniclers such as Juvani and Rashid Allen documented a mixture of amazement and fear in the Middle East and Persia. They were unable to dispute the effectiveness and discipline of the northern forces, whether as spectators or victims. They described thriving trading cities, enormous tent settlements that could hold thousands of people, and the capacity to quickly erect makeshift infrastructure wherever they went. It's interesting to note that the name Tatars gradually changed to Tartaria in many subsequent European maps and texts to refer to these soldiers' country. This shift from a people's name to the name of an entire region demonstrates how the human mind attempts to construct meaning by assigning a single label to a huge, undefined area in order to make it memorable and recollectable. And that name outlasted the very people who gave it its inspiration once it was associated with such potent imagery. Whether it was based on myth or reality, Tartaria was no longer merely a location on the map after that. It implied that here was the land of unbeaten warriors, of cities concealed behind the mountains and steppes, and of a fabled and genuine might. And it was this picture that would serve as the basis for the region's increasingly detailed drawings throughout the ensuing centuries, until it attained its utmost importance on global maps. The world in the Western mind was still a painting with vast empty regions throughout the Middle Ages, when Europe's sails had only just started to expand beyond the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic. A map's blank areas weren't simply uncharted terrain. They were mirrors that reflected the mapmaker's creativity. The homeland of the Tatar armies, which was subsequently dubbed Tartaria, appeared in that imagined environment as a vast area that was considerably larger than anything that was recognizable. Returning from their infrequent expeditions into East or Central Asia, missionaries, traders, and envoys described countless miles and how they could ride horses for a week and still not reach the horizon. They described rivers that could take a day to cross, mountain ranges that rose like fortress walls, and steppes that stretched like oceans. The notion of a single, uninterrupted region spanning thousands of miles was nearly unthinkable to Europeans used territories divided by feudal lines. This area was shown as a vast mass in the far north and northeast of the known world on numerous mappa mundi maps from the 13th and 14th centuries. Illustrations of walled cities, odd domed rooftops, and mounted soldiers are frequently used to adorn them. These drawings demonstrate that Europeans were starting to envision the region as a single, cohesive entity with its own social organization and architectural style, despite its geographical inaccuracies. The combination of myth and fact that was transmitted through traveler stories produced a picture that was half imagined and half real, with no obvious distinction between the two. Chinese and Korean sources from the East likewise characterized these outlying regions as large territories, with a diverse population that nevertheless had concentrated power centers, markets, trade routes from the western areas to Siberia, and fortified fortresses emerging from the grasslands were all mentioned in the records, all implying that this was a vast network supported by a balance of migration, trade, and military might, rather than an empty nothingness. Information from the East came slowly to Europeans at the time, frequently skewed by translation layers. However, Tartaria progressively took on a more distinct shape as some aspects were repeated, a region that could accommodate a variety of climates, populations, and settlement styles, while adhering to the same general framework. Only by contrasting it with the biggest empires they were familiar with could they comprehend it. However, this very ambiguity was harmful. There was plenty of space for imagination to flourish when knowledge was limited and dispersed. Thus, Myths of cannibal tribes, enormous monsters, and mountains concealing golden cities coexisted with tales of prosperous towns. Nobody could tell what was dream and what was reality. However, one thing was for sure: Tartaria was too big, too far away, and too foreign for medieval Europeans to completely understand. Everything that came after would be built upon these early representations. The image of Tartaria gradually emerged from the realm of legend and into the pages of cartographers as voyages increased and more detailed maps were produced, starting in the 13th century. These maps were detailed enough to appear as an unquestionable component of the global map, at least until they were removed centuries later. A new era for the whole Eurasian continent began in the 13th century. Formerly disparate regions were brought together by Genghis Khan and his descendants' military efforts, creating a single, expansive governmental area. The Mongol Empire did more than merely enlarge its territory. From the Yellow Sea to the Eastern European coasts, it established communication channels, commerce routes, and political structures. The name Tartaria started to firmly establish itself on European maps at this time. It is no longer the nebulous idea that it was centuries ago. Marco Polo traveled through regions that virtually no one in the West had ever seen when he left Venice and traveled far into Asia. He recounted crowded cities, colossal strongholds, and a network of relay stations along the road where traders and couriers could stop, change horses, and continue traveling. Despite being influenced by his own viewpoint, these findings contributed to a change in European understanding. Behind the name Tartaria was a vast system of settlements and government, not just a blank space. With fresh confidence, cartographers of the era started sketching Tartaria based on the accounts of Marco Polo and other traders and envoys. The area was frequently depicted as a huge block that occasionally occupied almost half of Asia on maps. From the 14th, the Catalan Atlas, Fromawaro's world map, and later iterations of Tommy's Geographia depicted Tartaria as dotted with lengthy mountain ranges, important rivers, and named cities. Evidence that the blank gaps on previous maps had been replaced by far more specific information. Tartaria Magna, Great Tartaria, Tartaria Muscovi, Muscovite, Tartaria Canesis, Chinese Tartaria, and Tartaria Terria are just a few of the notable zones that were frequently created from the land. This was a reflection of reality. Even though they were governed by separate political bodies, the old Mongol Empire's regions continued to have cultural, commercial, and technological ties after it broke up. All of these regions continue to be seen by Europeans as part of a single geocultural totality that they simply refer to as Tartaria. Maps of Tartaria frequently featured images of its unique architecture and lifestyle, including circular yurts, pointed towers, majestic domes, and well-organized cavalry columns. At this point, the significance of imagery surpassed that of geography. Maps told stories about the strength and strangeness of a place on the periphery of European knowledge, in addition to providing location information. Placing Tartaria on the map has significance beyond geography for the Western political centers. It meant that the world had been identified and documented, and that the major powers now had a keen interest in and desire for these far-off places. Maps were no longer only used to describe the world. They were also used to influence people's perspectives. Additionally, the name Tartaria became a default component of common knowledge once it took up a large portion of the page. However, a seed for the future was also sown by these precise maps. A few centuries after humans had been used to viewing Tartaria as a vast, cohesive entity, its demise would leave a perplexing emptiness, a question that future generations would have to face themselves. What actually transpired to cause a name that was so well known on maps of the world to disappear completely? However, Tartaria was still at its peak during this time. Explorers, diplomats, and merchants kept writing, trading, and returning with new tales about the area. These tales would spread throughout Europe, adding legend after legend, laying the groundwork for a time when Tartaria would be more than just a patch of color on a map. It would be a notion associated with riches, power, and unsolvable riddles. Under the Mongol Empire and its successors, the overland Silk Road's foundations became increasingly stable, and European traders and diplomats started visiting places they had previously only read about in stories. In addition to being trade reports, the stories they returned with were vivid depictions of a culture that the West had long perceived as barbaric and remote. Tartaria was no longer just a blank spot on the map in their eyes. Cities, strongholds, and intricately diversified communities were all part of it. Russian, Polish, and Italian traders described market towns lining the trade routes, where caravans bringing valuable crafts, spices, furs, and gemstones met. Despite being part of separate kingdoms, cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Ka were depicted in European reports as being a part of the larger Tartarian sphere. They were said to have imposing gates, tall brick walls, and lively central bazaars, where traders from far-off Europe, China, and Persia mixed. Massive fortifications defending key positions, located on steep hills, along riverbanks or rising out of the ground, were described by several Western explorers, such as Anthony Jenkinson of England, or Russian envoys in the 16th and 17th centuries. These buildings served Azmek more than just defenses. They served as tax collection locations, way stations, and safe havens for itinerant traders. Gate guards, storage warehouses, even water systems inside the walls, and a strong sense of order were all mentioned in several stories. The architectural diversity was one element that captivated visitors. A single city may have tall bell towers in the European style, Islamic-style domes, and wooden nomadic homes. Many Western observers were perplexed by this mixture, which spoke of centuries of cultural interchange. How could such wealth and sophistication be found in places that were thought to be outside the sphere of European civilization? Accounts of the people frequently highlighted its diversity, pointing out that Turkic and Mongol-speaking nomadic tribes were long-established communities that spoke a variety of languages and practiced several religions: Orthodox Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and even Jewish groups were involved in trade and skilled crafts. Tartaria was shown as a crossroads rather than a single monolithic land, thanks to this mix of civilizations. Information from traders and explorers was crucial to Western mapmakers and academics in order to fill in the blanks on paper. The more city names and descriptions of fortresses, rivers, and droughts they gathered, the more concrete and authentic Tartaria became in the minds of Europeans. Additionally, the word Tartaria was reaffirmed as an essential component of world knowledge with each subsequent map. However, this abundance also sowed the seed of mystery. Many of the city's strongholds and architectural wonders that were mentioned in those ancient documents have either disappeared completely or are only known by new names that have little to do with Tartaria as a concept. We must proceed to the following phase in order to comprehend why. How far forward was Tartaria really when its architecture and technology were the focus of intense discussion and tantalizing hints to a more important question? When Western explorers and traders wrote about Tartaria, they did more than just describe its cities, strongholds, and vibrant marketplaces. The technical and architectural aspects they came upon enthralled many. Features that, if their stories were true, considerably exceeded what Europe at the time believed a far-off primitive region could accomplish. According to some sources, there were massive domed buildings with spans of dozens of meters that were made of stone or burnt brick and were so carefully linked that the seams were hardly noticeable. Light from miles away was reflected by the tall, metal-capped spires that glittered in the sunlight. With their lengthy spans and precisely formed arches, massive stone bridges that spanned wide rivers were reminiscent of ancient Roman construction. Observers also asserted that they were much more sophisticated in certain instances. Public works were equally important. Large baths with distinct hot and cold water systems piped through metal or ceramic pipes buried beneath the flooring were described by travelers. Assembly halls, according to some, were light but cool even during the sweltering summer months because of the large circular windows embedded into the walls. Surprisingly, these methods were not limited to a few large cities. They recurred in various locations throughout Tartaria, as though they were all built according to the same architectural design. The structures whose purpose Westerners were unable to explain were perhaps the most fascinating. According to accounts, there are metal columns or towers on rooftops that are connected to other metal frameworks, like a gearbox system of some sort. They were thought to be lightning rods by some. Others envisioned a technique for energy transfer or even signaling. Such accounts have stoked subsequent conjecture that Tartaria might have formerly had technological systems considerably more sophisticated than we think, even though no concrete proof of this has survived. Some stories alluded to extraordinary material mastery in addition to architecture. Bronze alloys used to make the fortress walls and domes maintained their shine for many years. Bricks with a consistent color and remarkable endurance as well as wood prepared to withstand deterioration. Some contemporary scholars believe that Tartarian architecture was based on technical knowledge that was either intentionally omitted from popular history or lost to time as a result of these specifics. It was both shocking and unnerving for Europeans of the time to see such achievements in a place they had long considered to be on the brink of civilization. According to eyewitnesses, Tartaria was able to organize, build, and innovate on pace with, if not better than, portions of the West. Despite the fact that many maps and publications still depicted it as a huge, wild region. Because of these pictures that were spread throughout Europe, Tartaria was seen as both enigmatic and powerful. It evolved from a nameless area on the map to a unique entity with a distinctive architectural and technical identity. Identification is simple, but explanation is challenging. As the centuries went by, those buildings would serve as crucial hints for succeeding generations, looking for remnants of a civilization that might have been lost to official memory. One remarkable fact started to surface when the accounts of traders and adventurers were collected and contrasted. The main buildings appeared to have a nearly common architectural language. Regardless of where you looked, from the steppes of Central Asia to the frigid regions of Siberia, the towns of Eastern Europe, or even isolated communities farther off. Not because it was officially named that way, but rather because of the striking resemblance of characteristics that were too noticeable to ignore. People started referring to it as the Tartarian style. The dome was the most instantly identifiable feature, onion-shaped or extended cylindrical domes rising with perfect proportional balance, rather than the half-sphere of Roman tradition. Richly adorned in tiers, these domes were frequently placed atop tall bases and occasionally gilded or painted in vibrant hues. They projected both majesty and otherness from a distance, standing out like markers on the horizon. The domes were surrounded by thin spires that rose high and ended in a sharp metal point or geometric adornment. These spires may be freestanding, like enormous lampposts, or they could be fixed to the main construction. These spires were frequently joined by stone or metal frameworks to form a cohesive whole. They might look like energy collectors or transmission devices to the modern eye. They represented strength and exquisite craftsmanship to the people of the era. Proportion was another frequently disregarded component that subsequent engineers and architects became aware of. Tartarian structures seemed to adhere to rigid geometrical rules. The symmetry between height, width, and ornamental detail was almost flawless, whether it was in a town hall, church, or palace. Later researchers' measurements frequently showed recurrent connections to particular numbers, such as the golden ratio or historical geometric constants. The scope of this approach was what most surprised observers. It was evident in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan, but it was also present in Warsaw, Istanbul, and even farther afield in buildings in Chicago, San Francisco, Sydney, and Melbourne. Domes, spires, magnificent arched entrances, and perfectly symmetrical locades were common features of many buildings in former British, French, Russian, and American colonies. Migration and the expansion of European architectural influence are the conventional explanations for this pervasive appearance. But why the exact same style appeared nearly simultaneously in towns that are half a world distant is still a mystery. Many of them were constructed in a similar short period of time. What caused some of the features to be so similar that they appeared to have been taken from a single master blueprint? According to some alternative experts, these structures are the remains of a single, cohesive civilization that was destroyed by natural calamities or geopolitical upheavals. They contend that the surviving structures retain the original design, signature of that older age, even after being redated or rebuilt in later decades. They believe that one of the best indications that Tartaria was more than just a name on a map, but rather a vast urban architectural network, is the style's enormous global reach. The concept is still controversial, of course. Scholars of history feel that it is simplistic to include all dome and spire structures in Tartaria. However, even they are unable to fully account for the striking proportions and design shared by these structures. And this exact repetition feels like a signal to those looking for signs of a hidden past. Even though the name of its parent civilization has been removed from official records, there is still a shared architectural language in use today. The following question is inevitable from this point forward. How did Tartaria construct and maintain such structures if it really had an architectural impression on the world? The response prompts audacious hypotheses regarding the architecture, technologies, and energy systems that this civilization may have formerly possessed. If Tartarian architecture's domes and spires were visually striking from a distance, it was the technical secrets concealed within those same structures that captivated the attention of longtime observers. Many of these buildings still had elements that begged the question beneath their imposing exteriors. Were they only the results of exquisite craftsmanship? Or were they formerly a component of an intricate system whose workings we have long ago forgotten? The frequent appearance of metal poles, sharp-tipped finials, or antenna-like structures affixed to tall spires and top domes is one especially intriguing detail. In popular architectural explanations, these are typically referred to as lightning rods or ornamental embellishments. However, to some independent scholars, their shape and location imply the possibility of gathering or transmitting energy, including atmospheric electricity, a notion that was investigated centuries later by scientists such as Nikola Tesla. When you observe almost identical elements replicated over hundreds of structures located half a world apart, it becomes more difficult to reject the audacious notion. Similar concerns are raised by heating systems within Tartarian buildings. Many buildings include intricate ventilation channels and air ducts buried under floors or inside walls that are intended to disperse heat evenly over several rooms, especially in regions with harsh climates like Siberia or Eastern Europe. Some even have heated floors that are evocative of the Roman hypocaust system, although they are much larger and more intricately incorporated into the main architecture of the structure. Why did it show up in so many locations with such identical patterns if this was only a local invention? Their water systems were equally outstanding. Excavations in several regions that were formerly a part of Tartaria have revealed metal or ceramic pipelines that run deep underground and are directly connected to Sabu reservoirs that are housed inside or beneath public structures. These water sources were used for more than just necessities. They appear to be related to controlling a building's temperature, which is a type of climate control that we typically think of when we think of modern technology. Even the capacity to store and control energy is hinted at in certain ruins. Some have subterranean spaces that resemble control centers or machine rooms and are lined with conductive materials. These findings suggest that Tartarian towns might have operated as interconnected networks, with buildings connected by a common technical infrastructure. Even though the data is still inconclusive, these concepts are approached gingerly by mainstream academia, which frequently dismisses them as excessive interpretations or misreadings of ancient artifacts. Independent researchers respond that it's hard to understand how so many Tartarian structures could withstand centuries of minor degradation, especially in the face of severe weather, without taking such possibilities into account. Regardless of debate, one reality is clear. Not only was Tartarian architecture strikingly beautiful, It had technological elements that appear to have gone beyond what was considered appropriate for the time period to which it was officially allocated. It's simple to write off Tartarian architectural and technological characteristics as being exclusive to a particular era when examining a single building in isolation. However, an inevitable dilemma comes up when you arrange several towns on a map that stretches from Moscow, Kazan, and Irkutsk to Warsaw, Istanbul, and even San Francisco or Melbourne. How did essentially identical architectural codes exist in locations thousands of kilometers apart, or even on different continents? Domes shaped like onions, towering spires, symmetric cavalcades, extraordinarily tall and wide arched doors, and elaborate repeating ornamental patterns. These weren't merely general stylistic parallels. The proportions themselves, the height of towers, the dome's curves, and the window sizes are frequently matched with remarkable accuracy. It is difficult to attribute this homogeneity to purely regional variations in architectural impact or aesthetic trends. Additionally, the urban patterns of some of these cities were remarkably similar. A large domed edifice dominates the central plaza, with symmetrical streets extending out from it and public buildings, including municipal halls, theaters, and libraries, on either side. They were all arranged in such a uniform manner that when diagrammed their designs appeared to be nearly identical, as though they were taken from the same master blueprint. This order is still reflected in the street grids and foundations of cities when the original architecture is no longer there. On a casual inspection, you might overlook the more subtle nuances: metal spires atop skyscrapers, half-buried windows at street level, or elaborate designs with intricate geometric meanings. These same characteristics become much more apparent when comparing 19th century images of cities in Russia, Europe, North America, and Australia's, though the same design template had been imprinted on each place by an invisible hand. This is typically explained by mainstream architectural history as the outcome of Byzantine and neoclassical revival movements that expanded via colonization, trade, and cross-cultural interactions. However, this argument falls short for those who see that the consistency extends beyond aesthetics to technical aspects such as water channels, ventilation systems, and even foundation construction. And why do these structures, wherever they may be, frequently exhibit a level of longevity that is significantly higher than what would be predicted based on the dates that have been officially ascribed to them? There is a daring theory that all of these towns were formerly a single network, a worldwide or semi-global civilization with common aesthetic and technical norms. Buildings from that civilization were reused and given new dates after it vanished or was rebuilt, often with only slight alterations to conform to a revised historical account. A strange occurrence that occurs in many of these structures lends credence to this notion. The ground levels are either entirely or partially sunk beneath the street level of today. Windows are ankle height. Stepping down is necessary for main entrances, and in certain situations, whole levels are concealed underground. This is not a singular incident. It shows up in cities all across the world. Independent researchers have come to the mud flood theory as a result of these hints. The theory that a huge calamity that occurred at some point in the 18th or 19th century may have destroyed a large portion of Tartaria's physical footprint and buried the foundations of many buildings. We must investigate the mud flood itself, the supporting data, and the reasons it might hold the key to understanding how a whole civilization might disappear from maps and popular memory before we can draw any conclusions. Explore the historic neighborhoods of Kazan, Moscow, or St. Petersburg, and then contrast images of the same places taken over a century ago. An odd detail comes to light. Rows of windows in many buildings are positioned at ankle height or even lower than the street. These windows are bricked up in certain places. Others lead to dim, confined areas that appear to have been part of a floor that is now covered with dirt and rubble. It's not only a Russian curiosity, either. The same tendency is present in cities across the Atlantic, such as Boston, San Francisco, and even Sydney, as well as in European capitals like Warsaw, Prague, and Vienna. The wall's subterranean section frequently retains all of its ornamental details, brickwork with patterns, carved moldings, and even long-sealed doorways. Unless the ground level was lower when the building was constructed than it is now, no sane person would invest so much energy in a portion of a structure that was intended to be underground from the beginning. That's precisely what makes the question arise. What caused the earth to rise and engulf a whole floor? Photographs from the early 20th century add to the mystery. Some depict the excavation of streets, exposing light-filled, completely completed lower levels with undamaged windows and doors. There is a picture showing workers in St. Petersburg standing on the new street surface, with the so-called basement windows below them opening onto a spacious area that was obviously the old ground floor. Buildings in America with a completely submerged level exposed when the ground was disturbed can be seen in photographs taken during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. This isn't just found in big cities throughout Europe. The original first floors of many older homes in small towns are now used as basements. Sometimes you hear the same narrative when you talk to homeowners or residents. They found staircases that led to these basements while renovating, half-buried stairs that served as the original primary entryway. In some instances, remnants of previous house numbers or signage are still visible beneath the current street pavement. According to the conventional wisdom, street level is gradually raised by centuries of accumulation of dirt, rubbish, and road repair layers. However, mud flood hypothesis proponents argue that such a process would be time-consuming and uneven. The half-buried phenomenon, on the other hand, manifests regularly and at almost the same elevation in various cities. They contend that such uniformity points more towards a rapid, large-scale event than to gradual accumulation. Other hints are also mentioned by independent researchers. Parts of the lower wall beneath street level that exhibit noticeable color changes from the upper facade, hardened mud deposits, or erosion markings. They speculate that these might be the remains of a swiftly moving flood of dirt and mud that swept through streets, depositing thick sedimentary layers that buried the lower portions of structures. There would be considerably more repercussions than just decreased living space, if that were the truth. Large chunks of a previous civilization's technology, infrastructure, and tangible artifacts might have been destroyed in such an incident. Any integrated technical systems, water pipes, heating ducts, and metal fittings would disappear from view and be forgotten. by succeeding generations after the foundations and ground levels were buried. Photographs, drawings, and written accounts of this partially buried structure from Europe, the Americas, and Russia do not prove a worldwide mudflood. However, they do pose a legitimate query. When did the sudden disaster that caused this occur? What effect did it have on Tartaria? If there was such a civilization, we'll need to examine the mud flood theory more thoroughly from a geological and historical standpoint, as well as the remnants of an incident that may have had a global impact in the 18th or 19th century. In order to investigate that, photographs showing partially submerged ground floors appeared from locations as disparate as Melbourne, Warsaw, San Francisco, and St. Petersburg. The question of whether this was merely a local phenomenon and whether a single large-scale event may have affected several continents at around the same period started to be raised by independent scholars. The mudflood theory developed at this point. The theory holds that a unique geological or climatic catastrophe at some point in the 18th or early 19th century released enormous torrents of mud and debris that swept across regions of the planet. In a matter of hours or days, the lower stories of thousands of buildings were buried by the force and speed of these flows, which were sufficient to sweep across cities and transform them into basements. Advocates of the concept cite a number of potential reasons: large-scale earthquakes that cause massive landslides, volcanic eruption chains, abrupt and unusual tectonic shifts, or extreme weather events that melt a lot of ice and release mud and debris in torrents. Some even go so far as to make the speculation manufactured: the potential for a high-tech war whose record has been removed from official history, or an environmental weapon. One notable finding is the overlap between areas with the highest concentration of Tartarian architecture and several sites thought to have been affected by a mud flood. A secondary hypothesis follows from this. The tragedy erased much of the tangible proof of a civilization, making it more than just a natural calamity. Later generations redated the remaining buildings and changed their origin myths as they constructed on top of the ruins. Photographs from 19th century street excavations that show lower floors with intact windows, doorways, and even indications of current use are frequently included in the evidence presented. According to some stories, completely constructed building levels with interior furnishings and architectural characteristics that indicate they were originally main floors rather than storage basements were discovered beneath layers of dirt during foundation work. The submerged floors are explained by increasing street levels, urban redevelopment, or long-term silt buildup, according to mainstream science, which denies the existence of a worldwide mudflood. They contend that it is a widespread and well-documented practice to raise the earth in order to avert flooding or to accommodate new transportation systems. However, independent investigators argue, if this were purely local and gradual, why do we see the same effect at similar depths across so many cities on different continents, including those with no history of chronic flooding? There are still more unanswered questions. Why do so many images from the late 19th and early 20th centuries depict towns being excavated instead of merely constructed? Why are many towns' water and sewer systems situated at depths that imply the ground level was formerly much lower? And What would have happened to the urban network that we now identify with Tartaria if a cataclysmic event had actually happened? The mud deluge has become an integral feature of the Tartaria debate, both as the most contentious aspect of the civilization and as a suggested explanation for its material extinction. Despite the lack of a conclusive response, if accurate, it would indicate that a worldwide calamity that occurred just a few centuries ago has either been ignored or purposefully hidden in modern history. We'll need more concrete proof to delve deeper. Remnants of the mud flood may still be hidden in plain sight in 19th and 20th century photographs, drawings, and excavation reports, which are preserved in black and white pictures that appear normal unless you know what to look for. The mud flood theory was mostly a work of conjecture for a long time, spread by word of mouth and supported by observations of buried structures made today. However, it now has a new depth because of images taken in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Concrete, visual proof that cities are being excavated rather than expanded. Originally used to record large-scale construction projects or urban improvements, these black and white photos now pose a disturbing query. Did we actually see a new building or the discovery of something far older, St. Petersburg? Some photos depict streets that have been excavated so deeply that the entire bottom level of buildings, including the doors, windows, and even the staircases down to the ground level, are visible. Above them, the walls bear evidence of having formerly been exposed to sunlight, and workers stand at the bottom of recently dug roads. Brickwork is devoid of the damp stains you would anticipate in a genuine cellar, and paintwork is still evident. Similar photos show streets in Moscow that are significantly higher than the original entrances of older structures in certain images. The ancient doors are partially hidden beneath freshly constructed staircases that lead up to elevated entrances. Why are the underground portions completed with the same levelness as the main facade, if this was only the consequence of slow increases? In street level, photographs of entire streets being pulled apart in Prague, Vienna, and Warsaw, Europe, reveal deeper floors with arched windows, ornamental brickwork, and even signage. These might have been unremarkable technical documents or mementos at the time. They now have a different function, implying that many of the structures we believe to have been built in the 19th century may actually have been much older and were only lifted from the ground during these purported construction projects. Similar irregularities can be seen in photos of San Francisco taken after the 1906 earthquake in the United States. Many buildings were depicted with ground floors that were far lower than the present street level. When roadways were leveled and rubbish removed, doors and windows are half buried. Archival photos from Boston and Chicago in the late 19th century show extensive excavations around large structures that reveal lower levels that were obviously not intended as basements. Photographs from the early 20th century show buildings with subtle details that were exposed once stone and dirt were removed, even in Sydney and Melbourne. This poses an important query. Why, within a roughly identical historical window, did the same phenomena occur in both the northern and southern hemispheres? Common factors include increased transportation infrastructure, elevated road BDs for flood management, and sewer system modifications. the timing, scale, and visual resemblance of these sceneries across several continents, however, point to something much more global than ordinary local enhancements. According to proponents of the mud flood theory, these images become potent visual snippets of a different potential narrative when taken out of their original context, one where a whole architectural stratum was buried and then rediscovered under the pretense of modernization. Furthermore, the effects of a single event that could destroy that many buildings throughout the globe would probably go well beyond the obvious, possibly wiping out technology, infrastructure, and tangible evidence of Tartaria's existence. Naturally, the questions changed when those hidden levels were uncovered. What buried them, and what disappeared with them? Cityscape structures, technologies, or artifacts that would have demonstrated Tartaria's actual potential. The story then shifts to a pivotal moment in the 19th century, when the term Tartaria started to fade from maps, paving the way for its eventual near-complete erasure from the collective consciousness of the world. If the word to Tartaria appeared on maps of Asia as a huge block of color in the 17th and 18th centuries, that image started to shift by the 19th century, quite quietly but consistently, year after year, decade after decade. Tartaria's area on official maps shrank until it was completely gone, like a large piece of cloth being dragged into one corner. Maps created in Britain, France, Russia, and other significant European cartographic centers that included the majority of Siberia, Central Asia, and portions of East Asia were still referred to as Great or Grand Tartaries, in editions from the early 19th century. However, a few decades later, this once vast region started to disintegrate and give way to new names as new political borders emerged. Kazakh Steppe, Turkestan, Mongolia, the Chinese Empire, and the Russian Empire. The region known as Tartaria was pushed to the far reaches of Central Asia or China's northern frontiers, leaving only sporadic traces. It's remarkable that this change had nothing to do with any well-recorded political event. Neither the Treaty of Dissolution nor the Tartarian War existed. No official proclamation, no single turning point in history. It very silently but completely vanished from maps as though it had never been there. Independent researchers note that a number of other developments occurred at the same time as this cartograph Finkrenter: the creation of new international atlases, the acceptance of maps based on exact longitude and latitude, and the standardization of measures. More precise titles that mirrored the dominant political structure took the place of ambiguous or difficult-to-define entities like Tartaria under these new rules. As a result, a once dominant feature on world maps was divided into smaller sections, each of which was incorporated into an established empire. According to some historians, this is the inevitable evolution of geographic science, phasing out obsolete nomenclature. For those who maintain that Tartaria was once a single civilization, however, this process is akin to a concerted effort to obliterate the collective memory of a political and cultural entity that is no longer consistent with the revised historical account. The shift is evident in maps from the transitional era. Within 10 years, the Great Tartar would give way to the Russian Empire or Siberia in certain regions. Others would drive the residual Tartaria label eastward, reducing it to a thin line between China and Russia, and then, in the latter decades of the century, it would vanish completely. They contend that the fact that this period also saw extensive urban redevelopment projects that might have concealed or changed the appearance of older buildings while giving them new construction dates is not coincidental. The next generation would have little reason to believe that a large civilization had once existed in Tartaria. If buildings were labeled as newly constructed and the word Tartaria was removed from maps, a name's removal from a map signifies more than just a shift in terminology. It signifies a change in the way that the world is perceived. A name disappears from speech, textbooks, and memory when it is no longer used in print. Furthermore, it is nearly impossible to restore memory once it has been overwritten. Maps, however, only provide a portion of the tale. Geopolitical upheavals, battles, annexations, and boundary redrawings between the European, Russian, and Chinese empires accompanied this geographic shift. The ideal conditions for rewriting history and silently locking the door to Tartaria's past were established. There was political context for Tartaria's shrinkage on 19th century maps. During this time, wars, treaties, and territory changes among the major empires rocked both Asia and Europe. China, Russia, Qing, and the European powers, especially Britain and France, all aimed to increase and solidify their hold on territories that had previously been marked as part of Tartaria's borders on earlier maps. The Russian Empire steadily expanded into Siberia and Central Asia in the north and northwest. Along the Lena and Amur rivers, they had built forts and trading routes from the 17th century. By the 19th century, however, their goal was clear: to turn these vast lands into direct imperial possessions. Russia gained a strategic edge and the narrative authority to portray itself as the rightful heir to the territories once known as Tartaria by the conquest of the Central Asian Khanate Khokandets, Khiva, and Bukhara in the 1860s and 1870s. Any indication of the previous name would be eliminated once those lands were captured and shown on global maps as a part of the Russian Empire. Following a number of border treaties with Russia, the Qing dynasty was also compelled to redraw borders in the east. Particularly noteworthy are the Convention of Peking 1860 and the Treaty of Agen 1858. China planted large areas of Outer Mongolia and Manchuria. Although these concessions reduced Qing territory, they also removed the word Tartaria from both empires' official publications and enhanced Rushe Skartograp supremacy. The Qing imposed strict administrative control over the remaining territories, renaming areas, enforcing official nomenclature, and putting in textbooks a historical account that Tartaria had never been a separate political state. Afghanistan, the Himalayas, and the outskirts of Central Asia became strategic chessboards to the south and southwest. As a result of the great game between Britain and Russia, the European countries increased their surveying, mapping, and boundary-making efforts as a result of this rivalry, eradicating nebulous territorial notions. Ambiguous terms like Tartaria and no man's land were unacceptable in the imperial mindset. For the sake of control and negotiation, each area had to be under the jurisdiction of a specific political authority. The region's territorial redefinition was further expedited by the Opium Wars, unfair treaties, and Western countries' relentless commercial infiltration into China. The name Tartaria almost disappeared as both Russia and Britain created maps for commercial and political reasons, substituting other territorial divisions that suited their own strategic objectives. Importantly, all of this took place as international transportation and communications were becoming modernized. Empires were able to control the flow of information in addition to projecting physical control thanks to the Trans-Siberian Railway Thesia route through the Suez Canal and the worldwide telegraph network. A new worldwide consensus was established. When the new maps were created in large quantities and distributed consistently to government offices, colleges, and schools, Tartaria had never been a separate entity and was no longer in existence. This was the ideal time to remove a civilization from the communal consciousness, according to those who believe in the theory of a purposeful historical cover-up. In order to accommodate the new power structure, territory was divided, names were changed, populations were absorbed or moved, and the historical narrative was altered. Restoring Tartaria's recognition proved nearly impossible after the whole world map accepted this revised account of history. The next phase of erasing Tartaria did not occur on the battlefield by the time the world's political borders had been redefined by the wars, conquests, and annexations of the 19th century. Instead, it took place in the rooms of international standardization conventions, on the draftsman's table, and in the mapmaker's studios. At this point, geography, surveying, and cartography entered the industrial age, and a name could be permanently erased with Appian stroke and a measuring device's accuracy. Prior to the 19th century, autonomous graph centers produced the majority of global maps. In accordance with its own customs, each empire or country designated, partitioned, and represented territory. As a result, large, ambiguously defined names like Tartaria were able to endure. However, these ideas started to be seen as non-scientific as the push for regional standardization grew. Adoption of the worldwide latitude-longitude grid tied to the Greenwich meridian was a significant turning point. Specific names, nearly invariably associated with acknowledged political sovereignty, were used to fill in the ambiguous blanks on a map once each location and border could be determined mathematically. This new framework did not accommodate Tartaria, a geocultural category with ambiguous borders. An important role was performed by international meetings like the First International Geographical Congress in Antwerp in 1871 and later sessions. In this case, government representatives, geologists, and cartographers came to a consensus on uniform geographical names, clearly favoring the official administrative names of former empires. In these recently authorized lists, Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, and the Chinese Empire took Tartaria's place. Every region now fit within a definite political and legal framework that was supported by credible sources, such as the current imperial powers' official documents. Maps weren't the only things changed by standardization. It permeated the news, academic references, and textbooks. Within a generation or two, a term may become extinct once it is taken out of the public education system. Tartaria was viewed by late 19th century schoolchildren as a dusty place, ancient word found in scarce old texts, or worse, as a historical inaccuracy that was unworthy of being mentioned. This erasure was reinforced by industrial printing. With the large production and distribution of international atlases, the new Tartary free maps were adopted as the standard. Older maps that still had the name were relegated to archives within decades, and unless someone actively looked for them, they eventually vanished into obscurity. This standardization phase, according to some independent academics, was the real last straw for Tartaria's memory. A civilization could be weakened by geological occurrences or territorial disputes, but it could only be completely eradicated by removing its name from the official language. History loses its focal point when it isn't given a name, and a more practical narrative that fits the new order soon fills the gap. Tartaria had completely vanished from popular maps by the end of the 19th century, to be replaced by a patchwork of distinct regions ruled by modern empires. This appeared to be a victory of administrative effectiveness and scientific advancement. However, it represents the point in time when the memory of a massive entity, whether it be an empire, confederation, or cultural network, was preserved in the archives, leaving us with a historical void that has not yet been filled, according to those who are looking for hidden history. From this point on, the narrative shifts to a new section that is about memory and knowledge in general, rather than maps or borders. Changing a civilization's name alone is insufficient to eradicate it entirely. Additionally, it needs to be eliminated from libraries, novels, and the public's collective psyche. When archives, educational institutions, and even academia engaged in a silence that has now lasted more than a century, it marked the start of what believers refer to as the cover-up and rewriting of history. Gunfire, grand proclamations, inventory, lists, reclassification orders, and little slips of paper affixed to book covers or rolled maps are all examples of outmoded or erroneous references that do not circulate. The 19th century saw extensive modifications to national archives in many nations, particularly in the empires that had mostly absorbed the former Tartarian territory. Maps, travel journals, and reports from merchants or envoys were among the many collections of earlier items that were methodically examined and arranged using the new criteria. During this process, any document that referenced entities that did not fit the present political framework or utilized the phrase Tartaria was discreetly put into restricted storage. Although these objects weren't actually destroyed, they might as well have been for the general public. They were no longer available for loan, were no longer included in catalogs, and could only be examined with specific permission. Updated editions reflecting the revised borders and names replaced certain atlases from the 17th to 18th centuries that prominently marked the Mantartary in the main libraries of Europe and Russia. An average reader would not notice the originals as being different from the generally accessible versions, because they were arranged in various collections and occasionally banned in new covers. Old maps were occasionally supplemented with handwritten comments, although it is a brief line and no longer scientifically legitimate. The historical designation is sufficient to discourage the majority of scholars from going any further. Maps weren't the only things that disappeared into the vaults. The same fate befell manuscripts, explorers, journals, business documents, and sets of landscape drawings, travelogues that had previously spent pages detailing Tartaria were reprinted, with Siberia or Russian territory in place of Tartaria, and their descriptive sections were either completely removed or drastically reduced. The few copies that still contained the original text were either stored in private collections or allowed to deteriorate. The release of widely distributed educational atlases in the West served to further solidify this razor. There was absolutely no reference to Tartaria in these classroom versions, which were printed in tens of thousands and widely distributed. A generation that grew up with these maps would never have guessed that the identical territories had been given a different name just decades before. This, according to several independent researchers, was not an unintended consequence of upgrading referentiomerials, but a well-thought-out effort. The historical narrative could be changed without opposition after the name was removed from the foundation of official knowledge and the source documents were placed in restricted archives. Any surviving oral histories or visual proof could therefore be written off as folklore or anecdotal evidence, with no scholarly weight. As a result, by the late 1800s, the only information available to the average individual looking for knowledge about Tartaria would be family tales or an old book that had been neglected on a private shelf. As a quirky, out-of-date notion, the phrase only survived as a tiny footnote in mainstream research. If this civilization had indeed been, the door to what documents remained of it was now locked. The keys are hidden far away in archiving systems, out of most people's grasp. However, putting the materials away was just the beginning. The next step was to use academic training, textbooks, and education to mold knowledge at its foundation, such that future generations would not only forget the name, but would never consider challenging it. Limiting access to historical resources may irritate independent scholars. However, a more potent instrument was required to guarantee that a name vanished from popular memory. Instruction. Something is either never taught to a new generation, or is taught that it never existed. It fades into obscurity much more quickly than any official censorship could. The empires that ruled over a large portion of the old Tartarian territories had started to reform their educational systems by the late 19th century, virtually completely rewriting the geography and history curricula. Following Alexander II and III's reforms, Siberia, the Far East, and Russian Central Asia completely supplanted the word Tartaria in Russia's official secondary school geography textbooks. The new administrative borders were prominently shown on the accompanying maps, which colored each province in accordance with the empire's system of government. The fact that these regions had ever been known as Tartaria was not mentioned in a single line. Even in parts on medieval or early modern history, the name disappeared from all instructional materials. A comparable Lerser was formed in Qing, China, as a result of the reworking of gazetteers and educational materials. The histories of Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Manchuria were woven into the story of the Celestial Empire, and they were portrayed as administrative divisions of the Chinese Empire. Formal training prohibited the use of broader geographic terminology that did not correspond with official administrative divisions, dismissing them as barbarian labels. The similar pattern was adopted by Western powers, German, French, and British. Instructional atlases were widely dispersed throughout their colonies in the 19th century. The old Tartarian regions were designated as either Chinese or Russian empires on the maps. The Tatars and Mongols are never mentioned in European history textbooks as a large-scale political entity that persisted into the 18th century. Instead, they are only discussed in relation to medieval conquests. The modification changed the delivery or went beyond the content. Students of new generations were taught that ancient books and maps, if they came upon them, were either out of date or inaccurate. In many instances, educators were specifically told to clarify that Tartaria was not a civilization or a political state, but rather an ancient European name for northern nomadic tribes. This eliminated any motivation for students to conduct more research by locking their ideas within a pre-approved framework. The change was reaffirmed by universities and allies. For research, articles, and theses to be approved in academic circles, the new terminology had to be used. Any academic who tried to write on Tartaria in a serious way ran the risk of being called unscientific and losing their job. As a result, hardly anyone in the public or scholarly world questioned Tartaria's decline from a well-known term on international maps by the early 20th century. It had either been relegated to the domain of marginal footnotes or diminished to a vague historical phrase that was only discovered in rare old books or archives that were inaccessible to most people. Erasing the name was only the first step in the rewriting process. It even went so far as to rewrite the history of the regions that were formerly known as Tartaria, giving them a totally different past in which the present empires claimed the main role, and another force was needed to solidify that narrative of history on a worldwide basis. The universities and research facilities that influenced the official narrative and disseminated it globally. Academic centers became essential. Once textbooks were revised and educational systems as a whole obliterated the word Tartaria, these organizations had the authority to establish a civilization's official memory or, if required, to completely rewrite it. In addition to conducting research, these organizations in the 19th century shaped historical accounts to support political power and functioned as tools of imperial strategy. Large collections of artifacts and records from regions once known as Tartaria were held by national museums and geographic organizations in Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, and other countries. However, these resources were frequently reinterpreted within a new historical framework rather than maintaining their original context. One example of Europe's geographic ignorance at the time would be a map from the 17th century with the title, Great, a technical tool or article of a peril of unknown origin, may be associated with a particular ethnic minority that is not connected to the idea of a single entity. The new nomenclature started to be used consistently in academic literature. Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, Turkestan, and peoples that were formerly seen as belonging to Tartaria were characterized as dispersed, unconnected groups. These interpretations became the norm when they were published in esteemed journals and referenced by well-known scholars. Any opposing viewpoint might be quickly written off as a conspiracy theory or rejected as unscientific. By imposing their own power on the cultural landscape, imperial governments support this process. Remaining ancient buildings, even those constructed in the Tartarian architectural style, were renovated, decorated with modern national symbols, and given official construction dates that aligned with the updated story. It was possible to present a structure that had once functioned as an administrative or technological center inside Tartaria's metropolitan network as the creation of a renowned emperor, king, or architect from the governing empire, as the keepers of tangible memory. Museums also took part in the change by organizing their displays into the new geographic or thematic groups. The Tartarian artifacts that survived were dispersed among several collections. There may be pieces strewn throughout ancient Chinese or Russian history, one in the Islamic art hall, and another under Eurasian nomadic cultures. The idea of a single, cohesive civilization was so blurred by the fragmentation of the story that it was nearly difficult to see. This authority rarely extended to local or ethnographic research carried out by descendants of the old Tartarian territories. Often, manuscripts that deviated from the official historical framework were either printed in tiny internal runs or rejected for release. On the other hand, publications that supported the new narrative were quickly accepted as standard reference material and were given financing and marketing. The alliance of academic and political authority solidified a new reality over several decades. If Tartaria had ever existed at all, it was now merely a quaint historical oddity and an outmoded name. There were still pieces of the old story, maps, artifacts, and architecture, but they were so widely dispersed, mislabeled, and recontextualized that it was impossible to piece them together again. The memory of an old kingdom would still have existed, albeit in a different form. In the words of the people passed down from generation to generation, even if the term Tartaria had been removed from maps and textbooks in the areas that were once believed to be its heartland, these tales were told by the fireside at winter festivals or in the silent moments of a nomadic voyage. They were not recorded in chronicles or engraved on stone. On the other side of the steppe, the resemblances are frequently striking, even if each region had its own names, specifics, and symbols. The Yakut and Buryat people of Siberia, who lived before the north was covered by ice, tell about the ancient people who built cities out of white stone. They describe towns with spherical towers reaching to the sky, straight streets, and tall walls. Some claim that a sea of mud swept through after a major disaster, while others describe fire rising from the sky. The cities had been abandoned, either buried by ice and forest, or sinking into the ground. Kazakh and Uzbek oral traditions describe a vast khanate in Central Asia that stretches from sea to sea, with stone-paved roads so well maintained that a horse could travel for weeks without getting lost. Village elders continue to indicate that this was formerly their city gate by pointing to certain mounds or remains. Many of these stories attribute the demise of the monarchy to a black wind or earth deluge that raged for days before new kings arrived. Old songs about a northern kingdom with colossal structures that no one knows how to construct still reverberate throughout Eastern Europe, especially along the Volga and the Urals. According to some accounts, its people speak many languages, yet live under one roof and are aware of the secrets of heaven and earth. This could refer to advanced engineering or astronomy, according to contemporary Fossists. Notably, these traditions do not conflict with the representation of Tartaria found in historical maps and the diaries of Western traders. Instead, they provide information about everyday life, the size and connectivity of its cities, the unexpected catastrophe that caused its fall, and other elements that are absent from official history. Stories about black winds, advancing ice, or mud floods could be shared recollections of a geological event or natural disaster. something that the mud flood theory still implies. These stories are frequently dismissed by mainstream academia as skewed recollections of other historical events or as a combination of fact and fiction. Even so, many independent researchers have interpreted these legends as proof of a once unified civilization connecting temperate Eastern Europe, arid Central Asia, and cold Siberia due to their uniformity and breadth. These folktales are a treasure trove of information for anyone looking for signs of Tartaria. Although they might not provide exact dates or places, they do indicate where to look. Buried buildings, forgotten cities, and places where the communal memory has not been completely lost. In the 20th century, a fringe study movement emerged from these memory fragments, attempting to reconstruct the mosaic that official history had silently left behind. Initially, people who were interested in Tartaria did not identify as academic researchers. They were engineers, architects, journalists, and even soldiers serving on isolated frontiers who happened upon ancient maps or architectural ruins that the general public overlooked. In a local archive, a Russian engineer may find technical drawings for a building from the 19th century that had heating and ventilation systems that are more sophisticated than those of today. An 18th century French atlas could be purchased at a flea market by a history teacher in Kazakhstan. Its pages depict a ground artery that stretches throughout the continent of Eurasia. A parallel line of research outside of Orthodox history was progressively sparked by what started out as individual sparks of personal curiosity. As folk history initiatives and grassroots heritage organizations expanded throughout the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the West throughout the 1960s and 1970s, people who were interested in Tartaria started to connect with one another. They shared oral histories, maps, photos, and audacious theories. Many unofficial groups arose, frequently disguising themselves as study groups for ancient architecture or local history societies. In order to avoid being Caledonsientic, they put together what appeared to be disparate pieces into a more cohesive whole in discreet meetings at cafes, libraries, or private residences. Occasionally, Tartaria's name reappeared in independent publications in the West, where the academic environment was more open. Tartaria was featured as a classic example of a lost toponym in books about forgotten lands written by historical cartographers in the United States and Britain. Even though these writers tended to be careful, their inclusion of Tartaria in reputable reference works restored the term to bookshelves, although in specialized circles, the introduction of the Internet towards the end of the 20th century completely changed the scene. Through digitized historical maps, archive photos, and public discussion boards, enthusiasts from all around the world were able to interact. Pictures of partially demolished houses, maps with the Great Tartary highlighted, and passages from old travelogues were widely shared and analyzed and reanalyzed by online communities. Despite not yet receiving official academic acknowledgement, but division followed the spread. Some organizations used archaeological data, graphic comparison, and architectural analysis to approach Tartaria as a topic deserving of systematic study. Some incorporated it into a broader network of conjectural theories, from free energy technology to the notion of a worldwide civilization that has been forgotten, which increased the story's sensationality and made it simpler to write it off as a conspiracy. This uncertainty maintained Tartaria's equilibrium on the boundary between investigation and conjecture, between legend and history. But regardless of how it was handled, one thing is certain. The name Tartaria was on the verge of extinction. Thanks to the fringe research movement, it stopped being a small comment on a few old maps and started to be discussed all over the world again. An assault on historical accounts that had been uncontested for almost a century. The fringe study of Tartaria continued to rely on isolated meetings, letters sent back and forth via the mail. The previous boundaries of location, access to archives, and the size of participating circles almost vanished in the new realm created by the internet. In only a few seconds, thousands of individuals could access, download, and share a single digitized historical map, a picture of a building with its ground floor submerged, or a page from an old textbook that depicted the Great Artery. In the early 2000s, the first online discussion boards on the subject started to surface, frequently hidden behind sections titled Alternative History or World Mysteries. Inquiries such as why do all maps before the 19th century label Tartaria, but none in the 20th century do, were posted by members, along with pictures, maps, and passages from old publications. Why is the same architectural style prevalent on several continents during what official history refers to as the construction boom? Tartaria entered the visual sphere as YouTube and other video-sharing websites gained popularity. Videos comparing maps, analyzing architecture, or making before and after photo montages to support the mud flood theory started to garner millions of views. These images had an instant impact. It was no longer necessary for viewers to rely on written descriptions. The half-buried windows, the old maps, and the almost identical structures in places half a world apart were all visible to them. Social media made it feasible for these disparate pieces of information to link in previously unthinkable ways. A picture of a theater in Melbourne might be positioned next to pictures of a building in San Francisco and the City Hall in Kazan, which have almost the same domes and facades. The same consistent limits of Grand Tartary may be seen on both a modern British atlas and a French map from the 18th century. Such repetition, when displayed graphically, produced a convincing effect that was significantly stronger than any one piece. Additionally, the autonomous Tartaria research community started to create its own techniques. Some focused on looking for signs of buried towns by examining digital maps and satellite imagery in order to reconstruct the timeline of the name Tartaria's disappearance. Some people dig deeply into National Library's Internet Archives, tracking down every iteration of a map from year to year. Some teams concentrated on doing field assessments on the ground, taking pictures, measuring, and comparing the technical aspects of buildings thought to constitute Tartarian heritage. However, the thin line separating meticulous investigation and unbridled assumption presented a new issue as a result of the rapid expansion, making it simple for beginners to become sucked into inflated tales or tenuously supported relationships. Nevertheless, this same openness gave rise to new theories. Make Tartaria a really worldwide issue. It was no longer limited to a select few local history organizations or collectors of old maps. Anyone may now add a piece to the puzzle, a picture, a quote, or a folktale to the overall image. Even the most doubtful observers had to acknowledge that there was a tale that was still untold. Someplace as the quantity of fragments increased. After the internet united Tartaria fans worldwide, contemporary technology created a whole new line of inquiry that no explorer of the 18th or 19th centuries could have foreseen. Ancient writings and maps were no longer the only tools used in the search for remnants of this vanished realm. With the use of digital mapping tools, higher resolution satellite data, and extensive internet photo archives, it was now possible to reach into the sky and investigate areas that had previously been considered blank spaces in official history. Overlaying historical maps on contemporary digital maps is one of the most widely used techniques. Researchers frequently discover that areas that were originally classified as cities, strongholds, or commercial centers are now covered in forest. CURRENT satellite data. Underneath the dirt or vegetation, the satellite photos occasionally still show subtle geometric forms, large, straight lines, or perfect circles that resemble defensive walls or underground foundations. DEMS, or digital elevation models, have also been essential to the research. Researchers have discovered odd topographic characteristics in some areas, such as lengthy ridges or mound systems that are hundreds of meters long and too uniform in shape to be completely natural. These patterns frequently correspond with locations that were once inhabited by online image archives have turned out to be a treasure trove. 20th centuries are examined for recurring characteristics: domes, spires, half-buried windows, metallic finials, or municipal squares with perfect symmetry, which heightens suspicions of a common architectural network. Ancient pathways can also be retraced using contemporary mapping methods. Satellite photos of Central Asia reveal lengthy. These lines run across the continent with amazing consistency. Some of these routes pass through areas of Siberia that are now virtually deserted, but they are still visible from above. Elevated roads designed to resist flooding during certain seasons. It's amazing that independent researchers can do all of this without having a lot of money. They have created intricate schematics of alleged Tartarian city clusters, infrastructure networks, and terrain changes using only a personal computer, an internet connection, and mapping software expertise in order to verify what the maps indicate. A number of these digital discoveries have prompted on-the-ground excursions in which small volunteer teams visit the sites to measure, take pictures, and record video. This type of analysis is, of course, not without its detractors. Many of these traces, according to mainstream geographers and archaeologists, are merely natural formations or the remains of unrelated local civilizations. However, supporters of the Tartaria concept find it difficult to ignore the blatant recurrence of some patterns over thousands of km, particularly when their locations, sizes, and shapes correspond to those shown on ancient maps. According to them, the correlation supports the idea that there was once a single metropolitan network, the traces of which can still be seen on the ground by anyone who knows where to look. A more comprehensive picture started to take shape when information from digital maps, satellite photos, and archives of old photographs was combined. Buildings with remarkably similar architectural fingerprints could be found all over the world, from Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe to North and South America, Australia, and even some Pacific islands. These structures resembled repeated themes in a worldwide composition. The similarity extended beyond appearance. It encompassed architectural proportions, spatial arrangements, and even obscure technical elements buried deep within the structures. The most iconic emblem, the dome requirement, is present everywhere. The National Congress in Buenos Aires, the Boston Public Library, the Town Hall in Melbourne, and the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, they all have absolutely symmetrical plans, concentric circles in their architecture, and domes raised on high drums to maximize stability and visibility. Despite being credited to different architects and placed in different historical eras, these structures frequently have metal finials, spires, or intricately designed geometric decorations. Some people think that certain details might have had technological uses in the past, rather than just being ornamental. There is also a recurrent pattern in urban design. 4 or 6 large buildings encircle the central square in many cities, and they are connected by straight streets that frequently come together on a great domed or spired tower. According to conventional interpretations, this configuration occurs in places that are tens of thousands of kilometers apart and have no recorded history of direct interaction. Technically speaking, the similarities are even more fascinating. The same kind of closely linked ashlar stones is used in numerous ancient buildings throughout continents. Bricks that are remarkably consistent and consistently burnt, or joints so fine that a blade cannot pass through them. If the given construction dates are believed to be accurate, several buildings still have integrated water channels, hidden ventilation systems, and underfloor heating features that significantly surpass the technological standards of their purported era. Many times, the foundations or ground floors show entirely different building techniques than the higher parts, indicating that the present building was built on a much earlier base, which some scholars consider to be direct Tartarian heritage. Such coincidences, according to proponents of the unified global civilization idea, are too significant to be coincidental. They propose that there was a global network of architecture and cities that shared standardized design principles and technological know-how before it was broken up by natural disasters or political unrest. The remaining structures in this network were repurposed and given new origin myths that were adapted to local historical narratives after it collapsed, which may have happened in the 18th or 19th century. A contrasting explanation is provided by mainstream academia, which attributes these similarities to the global dissemination of popular late modern forms like bazaar, neoclassicism, and the Byzantine revival that were brought about by trade, colonization, and cultural interaction. However, this does not take into consideration the corresponding internal technological details for independent researchers, a type of engineering that is much more difficult to replicate accurately than external decoration. Although there isn't any concrete evidence yet, this global architectural comparison has forced many people to view Tartaria very differently. It is currently the focal point of a much bigger proposal rather than merely a vanishing name on outdated maps. That a civilization with a global network of cities, buildings, and technology might have existed at one point, but that it was removed from the official record of history in less than 2 centuries. As a result, the emphasis is no longer just on identifying the architectural similarities, but also on how they have affected historical thinking. If these correspondences are authentic, they call into question the basic standards by which we gauge advancement. The next query is, how does this upset the whole structure of history as we know it? Rather than, do they still look alike? The neat ladder of linear historical advancement needs to be demolished if the Tartaria hypothesis is correct. Our path may have been a cyclical pattern of peaking and then collapsing, leaving behind fragmented, disconnected memories, rather than a continuous ascent from primitive to advanced. The benchmarks by which we gauge progress would need to be adjusted in light of this. For instance, the post-industrial revolution age is frequently linked to intercontinental commerce networks, global urbanization, and standardized architecture. However, many of our contemporary accomplishments might just be reiterations under a different name if such a network had previously been in place for centuries, supported by a different civilization. Our perception of other ancient civilizations is similarly altered by this reinterpretation. It is possible that other civilizations in Africa, South America, or Southeast Asia suffered similar outcomes if Tartaria could be wiped out of history. Every new finding of a structure that isn't at the technical level attributed to its time would be viewed as additional proof of a larger trend, rather than as a singular outlier, because popular history only tells a small part of a much bigger picture. A notion like this clearly calls into question the legitimacy of historical geology, archaeology, anthropology, and other fields that examine the past. How defective are our procedures for gathering, confirming, and conserving historical evidence if a civilization as large and interwoven as Tartaria might be omitted or erased? To support the prevailing narrative, how many pieces of evidence have been reinterpreted, and are we forcing a predetermined evolutionary course upon pieces of history that don't want to follow it? In the field of social psychology, there is another consequence. A feeling of stability and direction is offered by the linear model of development, the reassuring conviction that people are always evolving and learning from their mistakes in order to prevent them from happening again. However, if history is truly a sequence of ups and downs, then current affluence is not a guarantee, and there is always a chance that our civilization's basis will be lost. Although admitting this possibility can be disconcerting, it can also encourage more prudence, modesty, and reverence for the past. Extending the viewpoint, Tartaria's opposition to linear advancement encourages an alternative strategy. Civilizations can cohabit, overlap, and succeed one another in non-linear ways throughout history, which is a multifaceted flux. According to this framework, truth is found in the readiness to accept several levels of memory, numerous alternatives, and the enormous gaps that still need to be filled, rather than in a single authoritative story. The ramifications would extend well beyond the library and museum shelves if Tartaria's memory were ever resurrected with concrete proof that it was once a single, cohesive civilization with sophisticated architecture and technology. The political, cultural, and cognitive order of the world would be severely disrupted by such a disclosure. First, many countries would have to deal with challenging issues regarding the validity of their own national histories. Claims of independent origin or uninterrupted historical continuity would need to be re-examined if portions of their area were once a part of a wider, interconnected civilizational network. This would be more than just a prestige issue. In areas long claimed as part of the founding history of the present state, it would touch on issues such as borders, historical ownership, and even rights to natural resources. The legitimacy of the empires that previously assisted in erasing Tartaria's name from the map may therefore be directly questioned if Tartaria's memory were restored. Those powers would come under political and moral pressure if it turned out that Tartaria's disappearance was the product of a planned campaign that involved renaming places, redrawing maps, and rewriting history. Such disclosures might result in requests for formal apologies, compensation, or at the very least, official acknowledgement in the current environment, where past accountability is becoming more and more expected. Religion and culture would also be affected by a global civilization that shares a common set of symbols, architectural styles, and technical know-how. Many belief systems would need to adjust to this new reality if symbols that were previously believed to be exclusive to Europe, Asia, or the Americas all sprang from a similar source. Economically speaking, Tartaria's architectural legacy and associated archaeological sites would become the focus of international study, conservation, and tourism if it were officially recognized. There may be tremendous advantages to this, but there may also be fierce conflicts over management and exploitation rights. Who would be in charge of protecting monuments that are dispersed over dozens of nations, yet all have to do with the heritage of a vanished civilization? Lastly, the shift in global consciousness might be the most significant. Recognizing that a civilization such as Tartaria existed and was wiped out would cause the public to reconsider the reliability of official accounts. There would probably be a rise in skepticism about established organizations, including governments and academics, which would increase demand for independent research. This might result in a society that is more interested in and independent of historical research. But as many groups view the past in conflicting ways, there is also a risk of fragmented understanding. And if that time arrived, the most important question for each of us would be, how can we tell the difference between the new truths and the stories that have been written to fill the gap? The first step in answering that question is to use the ability to check critical thinking, not to take sides. This does not require us to trust an enticing story right away. Furthermore, it doesn't call for us to erase every bothersome trace. It challenges us to take a moderate stance, cross-referencing sources, relating evidence, and being prepared to modify our judgments in light of new information. This implies, in the case of Tartaria, not disregarding the visual evidence, archival data, and enduring similarities in folktales, but also not jumping to a complete acceptance of the erased civilization story just because it is compelling. It is not necessary to completely reject official history in order to accept options that are not widely accepted. Rather, it creates room for parallel stories to coexist and other historical accounts that might not be entirely confirmed just yet, but are compelling enough to cause concern and encourage more research. New concepts, surprising findings, and unanticipated viewpoints have the potential to surface in this area. Tartaria is a perfect illustration of how historical knowledge is a large patchwork that can have fresh additions, changes, and replacements. This perspective on history tells us that the pursuit of truth is a continuous process of enlarging and improving the image, rather than a journey to a single destination. Peaceful and highly advanced civilization. However, Tartaria would have had its own shortcomings, disputes, injustices, and restrictions if it had actually existed. Mature knowledge, like any complex civilization, comes from examining both sides rather than substituting one romanticized narrative for another. In the end, accepting ideas beyond the realm of conventional history is not limited to academics or researchers. In a time where information and disinformation abound, it is a social and personal talent. Avoiding being swayed by intentionally constructed narratives will require the capacity to challenge, track the sources of facts, evaluate other points of view, and modify our position when new information becomes available. If Tartaria teaches us anything, it is that if we do not maintain the practice of asking questions and looking for the truth, then not only may a great civilization have been lost, but any story can be lost as well. Preserving critical thinking skills and an open mind will be essential to protecting human memory from the passage of time and from those who would mold it to suit their own purposes. Smothered beneath a thick coating of time dust and intentional forgetting, Tartaria appears to me as a gigantic silhouette in the desert of our collective psyche when I think of that experience. A new contour appears every time someone carefully removes a small amount of that dust. A yellowed piece of map, a straight avenue, a dome. Each piece suggests that the larger, more complex, and much more bizarre picture below is not what we have been taught. Folk stories that never go away, and old maps with vast arteries. Every item that has been recovered appears to fight back against centuries of stillness. However, they also highlight how big the task is. It is not just an archaeological or historical problem to restore a memory that may have been intentionally obliterated. It directly challenges the power structures that erected the wall to conceal it. Thus, the most important question remains there, like a persistent cloud. Would the world be able to handle it if there were ever proof of Tartaria? Would we be willing to rewrite entire eras of world history in order to acknowledge that a large portion of what we have relied on for generations is not accurate? Or, like many previous civilizations, will we respond by holding on to the old narrative because it is more secure, recognizable, and less destructive of the established order? A new era of investigation could be ushered in by the discovery of Tartaria's truth, which could rekindle a long-suppressed curiosity. However, if current power structures feel threatened and boundaries not just on maps, but also in people's minds, are questioned, it may just as easily bring turmoil, division, and bloodshed. Despite all of those possibilities, one thing is guaranteed. Whether true or not, the tale of Tartaria serves as a mirror reflecting the nuanced interplay between memory and humanity. It demonstrates that we are both the writers and the products of history. Truth is sometimes preserved, and other times it is buried deeper, and every generation must make its own judgment after seeing Tartaria's dust-covered silhouette. Will it dare to go farther regardless of what might be discovered? Or will it allow the figure to be forgotten? The real legacy of Tartaria may lie in that question, a warning that truth never emerges from the shadows by itself. It only manifests when a person is prepared, brave, and patient enough to confront it, even if the response challenges everything they believed to be true. Thank you for joining Secret Historian on this extraordinary journey into the warnings left behind by those who vanished. if you believe the past still holds wisdom, if you know deep down that history was never asleep, only waiting, subscribe now to Secret Historian.